I never expected that my roommate getting the flu would completely change my life, but that's exactly what happened. It wasn't the fever or the coughing that did it. It was two words he whispered to me in the middle of the night, in the dark of his bedroom, followed by a simple gesture that unraveled everything I thought I knew about him and about myself. My name is Lucas. At the time, I was 26, working as a freelance web designer from the quiet sanctuary of my bedroom. My life was a neat collection of routines. Wake up, coffee, code, lunch, more code, maybe a walk if the weather was nice, dinner, and then winding down with a book or a movie. It was predictable, stable, and profoundly lonely, though I didn't always like to admit that last part. The routines were a kind of armor, a way to keep the quiet from feeling too loud. The apartment itself was a testament to this structured life. It was a decent two-bedroom on the third floor of a brick building that always smelled faintly of rain and old wood. My side of the common space was minimalist and organized. A single fiddle-leaf fig stood by the window, my books were arranged by color on the shelf, and the throw pillows on my end of the couch were always perfectly fluffed. It was a space that said, "Nothing unexpected happens here." And for a long time, nothing did. Then Caleb moved in. He answered my ad for a roommate after my previous one got a job in another state. From the moment he walked in for the viewing, he was like a force of nature disrupting my carefully curated calm. He was all broad shoulders and easy smiles, with a laugh that seemed to fill every corner of the room. He worked in construction management, a job that seemed to perfectly match his physical presence and confident energy. His hands were calloused, his boots were always a little dusty, and he smelled like sawdust and fresh air. He was, in a word, everything I was not. And I was, from the very first day, completely captivated by him. I watched him from the corner of my eye, studying the way he'd run a hand through his dark, unruly hair when he was concentrating on a bill, or how his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he told a story about his day on the site. He was friendly, a perfect roommate in all the practical ways. He cleaned up after himself, paid his rent on time, and was generally considerate. But there was a distance, a roommate distance. More than that, there was a distance I assumed was unbridgeable. Caleb moved through the world with an effortless confidence that I associated with straight men. He talked about sports, he drank beer with his work buddies, and on the few occasions he mentioned past relationships, it was always with a she. So I filed my attraction away in a mental box labeled hopeless and not to be opened. I became a quiet observer of his life, a background character. It was safer that way. Protecting my own heart felt like the most sensible thing to do. Our lives ran on parallel tracks that only occasionally intersected in the kitchen while one of us was making coffee, or in the living room when we both happened to want to watch the same game. The conversations were pleasant but superficial. How was work? Good, you. Any plans for the weekend? It was a comfortable arrangement, but it wasn't a friendship, not really. It was a cohabitation, and I told myself that was enough. It had to be. The change came on a Tuesday in October. The air had turned crisp, and the leaves outside our window were a riot of gold and red. I just finished a project and was enjoying a rare moment of quiet in the late afternoon, sipping tea and staring out the window. Caleb came home early, which was unusual. I heard his keys fumble in the lock, and the sound of the door opening was heavy, sluggish. He shuffled into the living room, and I turned from the window. He looked awful. His usually ruddy complexion was pale and clammy, his eyes were glassy, and he was hunched over, wrapping his arms around his midsection. He dropped his work bag on the floor with a thud and sort of collapsed onto his end of the couch. "Hey," I said, my voice laced with immediate concern. "Are you okay?" He just shook his head, a slow, miserable motion. "Don't feel good, man," he rasped, his voice rough and weak. "Came on all of a sudden at work. Just everything aches." That was the beginning of it. The inciting incident, if my life were a movie. It wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was quiet and miserable. It was the common flu, but it hit Caleb like a freight train. He was one of those people who was never sick, whose body was a reliable machine. So when it finally failed him, it failed him completely. He had a fever that spiked dangerously high, a cough that shook his entire frame, and an exhaustion so profound he could barely make it from his bed to the bathroom. For the first day, he tried to tough it out. He holed up in his room, insisting he was fine, that he just needed to sleep it off. But by the second morning, the The pretense was gone. I knocked on his door to check on him and found him tangled in his sheets, shivering despite the sweat beading on his forehead. He looked small in his big bed, diminished. The usual spark in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dull haze of fever and discomfort. "Hey," I said softly from the doorway. He cracked an eye open. "Need anything? Water? Food?" He groaned. "Could use some water." I went to the kitchen, filled a tall glass with ice water, and grabbed some ibuprofen. When I returned, I didn't just leave it on his nightstand. I found myself pulling the chair from his desk over to his bedside. I sat down. The professional boundary of roommate was already starting to dissolve. He was vulnerable, and something in me, something beyond the hopeless crush, felt an overwhelming need to take care of him. "Here," I said, holding out the pills and water. He struggled to sit up, his muscles trembling with the effort. Without thinking, I put my hand on his back to steady him, my palm flat between his shoulder blades. His skin was burning up, even through his t-shirt. It was the first time I had touched him in a way that wasn't an accidental brush in the hallway. The contact sent a jolt through me, a strange mix of clinical concern and a deeply personal awareness. He swallowed the pills, drank half the glass of water in ragged gulps, and then sank back onto the pillows with a sigh. "Thanks, Lucas," he mumbled, his eyes already drifting shut. "Really?" And just like that, I became his caregiver. The parallel tracks of our lives had been forced to merge. My work deadlines were suddenly secondary to the rhythm of his illness. I spent the next few days in a strange new routine. I'd work for an hour or two, then pause to check on him. I brought him lukewarm tea and toast he barely touched. I made chicken soup from scratch, the apartment filling with the scent of thyme and ginger. I kept a log of his temperature and made sure he was taking medicine on schedule. In those quiet, focused moments, I learned things about him that our superficial hallway conversations had never revealed. I saw the way his brow furrowed in his sleep, as if he were wrestling with some complicated problem in his dreams. I noticed a small, faded scar just above his left eyebrow that I'd never seen before. I learned that he hated the taste of orange-flavored medicine and that when he was feverish, he would sometimes mumble incoherently about blueprints and support beams. He was utterly dependent on me, and the vulnerability this created between us was palpable. One afternoon, his fever was particularly high. He was restless, kicking off his blankets and then shivering moments later. I soaked a washcloth in cool water and gently wiped his forehead. His eyes fluttered open, hazy and unfocused. He looked at me, really looked at me, for a long moment. There was no pretense, no casual roommate smile, just a raw, unguarded stare. You're really good at this," he slurred, his voice thick. I wasn't sure what this was. Taking care of people? Being responsible? I just gave a small, uncertain smile. My mom was a nurse. I guess I picked up a few things he hummed in response, a low, contented sound, and his eyes slipped closed again. But in that brief moment of lucidity, something had shifted. He wasn't just my hot, unattainable roommate anymore. He was Caleb, a person who was sick and needed help, and I was the one providing it. The dynamic between us was being rewritten, sentence by sentence, in the quiet, sick-scented confines of his bedroom. The revelation of his vulnerability went deeper than just the physical illness. It was in the small, unguarded moments that the fever afforded. On the third night, he was struggling to sleep, caught in that frustrating twilight state between waking and dreaming. I was sitting in the chair by his bed, reading a book under the dim light of his lamp, just wanting to be nearby in case his fever spiked again. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of his ragged breathing. Suddenly, he spoke, his voice clear but distant, as if he were talking to someone else in the room. It always had to be perfect. Dad wouldn't accept anything less. I looked up from my book, startled. His eyes were closed, but his face was tense. He was dreaming, or somewhere close to it. Every joint, every measurement. Good enough was another way of saying failure, he shifted, groaning softly. It was a tiny, unguarded glimpse into his past, into the forces that had shaped the confident, capable man I knew. The man who managed construction sites, who dealt in precision and strength, had been a boy who was afraid of not being perfect enough for his father. My heart ached for him. It was a strange, powerful feeling. This wasn't just attraction anymore. It was a deeper, more complex empathy. I saw the pressure he must have put on himself, the foundation of his relentless competence. His confidence wasn't just an innate trait, it was a skill he'd had to build, a defense mechanism. It made him seem so much more human, so much more real to me. The untouchable ideal I had built up in my head began to crumble, replaced by the image of a man who was strong, yes, but who also carried his own hidden burdens. Later that same night, a small, significant moment occurred that I would replay in my mind 100 times. He'd finally fallen into a deeper sleep, but his coughing fits were still jarring him awake every hour or so. During one particularly rough spell, he started trying to push himself up, gagging. I shot out of my chair, instinctively reaching for him. "Easy, easy," I murmured, putting one hand on his shoulder and using the other to help prop him up. I held a glass of water to his lips, and he took a few sips. As he leaned back against the pillows, his hand came up, and, for a second, it rested on top of mine on the mattress. It wasn't a grab or a hold, just a light, fleeting touch. His skin was still hot, my own suddenly cool and clammy in comparison. The contact lasted for maybe 3 seconds, but time seemed to stretch and warp around the simple point of connection. His fingers were rough, calloused from his work, a stark contrast to my own smooth, keyboard-worn hands. In that brief touch, the entire chasm between our two worlds, the construction manager and the web designer, seemed to vanish. There was just us, two people in a dimly lit room. He pulled his hand away as he settled back into the pillows, and neither of us acknowledged it. He was probably too sick to even register it properly. But for me, it was everything. It was a tiny spark in the dark, a whisper of possibility that I had long ago taught myself to ignore. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, hopeful rhythm. I retreated to my chair, my hand still tingling where he had touched it. I told myself it meant nothing. It was the involuntary movement of a sick man. An accident. But here's the thing about hope. It doesn't always listen to reason. It clings to the smallest of gestures, the most insignificant of moments, and builds a world out of them. And in that moment, my hope was building a cathedral. The turning point came on the 4th night. His fever had finally broken that morning, leaving him drenched in sweat, but lucid for the first time in days. He was still weak, completely drained, but the worst of the illness had passed. I had helped him change into a clean t-shirt and fresh sheets, an act of care that felt both incredibly intimate and entirely necessary. He was exhausted by the simple effort and had fallen into a deep, natural sleep for most of the afternoon. I thought my duties as a nurse were mostly over. I planned to sleep in my own bed for the first time in nights. But around 2 in the morning, I was woken by a sound from his room. A small, distressed cry. I sat up in bed, my senses on high alert, and listened. It came again, a choked-off sound of fear. He was having a nightmare. I got out of bed and padded quietly to his door, pushing it open a crack. In the faint moonlight filtering through his window, I could see him thrashing in his bed, his hands clenched in the sheets. He was muttering something I couldn't understand, his breathing fast and panicked. The fever might have been gone, but the ghost of it still lingered, haunting his sleep. My instinct took over. I walked into the room and sat on the edge of his bed. "Caleb," I said softly. "Hey, Caleb. Wake up. You're just dreaming." I placed a hand on his arm, and he flinched violently, his eyes flying open. They were wide with panic, darting around the dark room before they finally landed on me. Recognition dawned slowly. "Lucas," he breathed, his voice hoarse. "What?" "You were having a nightmare," I explained gently. He let out a long, shaky exhale and scrubbed a hand over his face. God, it felt so real. He looked small and scared, all his daytime confidence stripped away by the terrors of his own mind. He was still trembling slightly. He looked at me, his eyes pleading in the dim light. "Hey, this is going to sound weird," he started, his voice barely a whisper. "But could you just stay? For a little while? I don't want to be alone right now." My heart did a painful clench in my chest. It was the most vulnerable I had ever seen him. "Of course," I said, my own voice softer than I intended. I expected him to gesture to the chair, but he didn't. He just shifted over in his queen-sized bed, creating a space beside him. An unspoken invitation. My mind was racing. This was crossing a line. A big one. Roommates didn't do this. But the man in the bed wasn't just my roommate at that moment. He was Caleb, and he had asked me for help. Slowly, cautiously, I lay down on top of the covers, on the very edge of the mattress, my back mostly to him. I was as stiff as a board, terrified of making a wrong move. The silence in the room was immense, filled with the sound of our breathing. His was still a little ragged. Mine was shallow and nervous. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, even from a foot away. We lay like that for what felt like an eternity. Then, his voice cut through the darkness, low and raspy. Switch sides. It was a simple command, but it sent a shock wave through me. I turned my head to look at him. I could just make out his silhouette against the window. What? I asked, my voice tight. Switch sides, he repeated, a little more firmly. I want to be on the outside, closer to the door. It's stupid, I know. It just makes me feel less trapped. It was such a strange, specific request, but I didn't question it. Numbly, I slid off the bed, walked around to the other side, and got back in, this time under the covers because it felt even more awkward to be on top of them now. I was now sandwiched between him and the wall. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, every muscle in my body tensed. He was so close I could feel the warmth of his breath on my shoulder. We were quiet again for another long minute. I was trying to regulate my breathing, trying to convince my heart to stop beating like a trapped bird. This was just comfort. He was post-fever, spooked from a nightmare. This meant nothing. It was just one person helping another. I repeated it like a mantra in my head. And then it happened. I felt a subtle shift in the mattress, and then a weight settled over my legs. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Caleb had moved, hooking his leg over mine. His thigh was resting on top of my shins, his knee nestled against my own. It wasn't a sexual move. There was nothing aggressive or suggestive about it. It was an act of pure, unconscious anchoring. A person seeking solid ground in the dark. But it was also the most profoundly intimate thing I had ever experienced. The simple, possessive weight of his leg over mine was a declaration. It was a tangible connection in the darkness, a physical manifestation of the trust he had placed in me over the last few days. My whole body was electric. I could feel the texture of his pajama pants against my own, the solidness of his muscle and bone. All my carefully constructed walls, all my rationalizations and self-protective measures, they all just dissolved. I lay there, pinned by his simple need for comfort, and felt the entire world shift on its axis. And for the first time, I didn't fight the hope. I let it wash over me, terrifying and beautiful all at once. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, listening to his breathing as it evened out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep, feeling the weight of his leg on mine, and wondering if anything would ever be the same again. The next morning, I woke to the feeling of an empty space beside me. I blinked my eyes open, disoriented for a moment, before the memory of the night before came rushing back. The whisper, the weight of his leg. I sat up. The space where Caleb had been was empty, the sheets cool. I could hear the shower running in the bathroom down the hall. My heart started a low, anxious thrum against my ribs. How were we supposed to navigate this? What did you say to someone after that? Hey, thanks for using my leg as a teddy bear last night. A new awareness filled the apartment, as thick and heavy as the humidity before a storm. The air was charged with unspoken questions. When Caleb finally emerged from his room, he looked better, more like himself. Color was returning to his face, and he was dressed in jeans and a hoodie instead of sweatpants. But his movements were tentative, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. Morning, he said, his voice directed at the refrigerator as he opened it to grab the orange juice. It was gruff, a little too loud. Morning, I replied to my coffee cup. Feeling better? Yeah, a lot better. I think I'm over the worst of it, he said, still not looking at me. He poured a glass of juice and drank it down in 3 quick swallows, his back to me the whole time. The casual ease that had once defined our cohabitation was completely gone, replaced by a brittle, fragile tension. We were two strangers who knew each other's secrets, and it was excruciating. He retreated to his room for most of the day, claiming he needed to catch up on rest. I knew it was an excuse. We were avoiding each other. The vast expanse of our small living room had become a no-man's land. Every time I heard his door creak, my entire body would tense. When we passed in the hallway, we'd both find a sudden, urgent interest in the scuff marks on the floorboards. It was a silent, agonizing dance of avoidance. My mind, meanwhile, was a battlefield. I sat at my desk, staring at a half-finished web design, but I wasn't seeing lines of code. I was seeing the darkness of his room. I was feeling the weight of his leg. The internal analysis was relentless, a looping, torturous cycle of hope and fear. One moment, I was convinced it was a breakthrough. The vulnerability, the request for me to stay, the physical contact. It had to mean something, right? He was post-fever, yes, but he was lucid. He had known what he was asking. The command, switch sides, felt intentional, deliberate. It was a conscious choice to bring me closer. But then, the fear would creep in, a cold and logical counterargument. I was his caregiver. He was sick, scared, and disoriented. He would have asked for the same comfort from anyone, a friend, a sibling, maybe even a stranger if he were desperate enough. The leg hook? A simple muscle spasm, an unconscious reflex of a sleeping man seeking warmth. I was a convenient, warm body in a moment of need. That's all. I was projecting my own desires onto a meaningless situation. I was building a cathedral on a foundation of wishful thinking, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. This internal debate was exhausting. Every scenario ended in potential heartbreak. If it meant something, what was the next step? How could I possibly bring it up? And if it meant nothing, how could I go back to being just his roommate, knowing what it felt like to have him depend on me, to have him that close? The memory of his leg resting over mine was branded into my brain. I could still feel the phantom pressure, a constant reminder of a boundary that had been irrevocably crossed. I was terrified he was regretting it, that he was embarrassed by his moment of weakness and now saw me as a reminder of it. The thought that I might have made him uncomfortable was almost more than I could bear. The hope was a fragile, flickering candle flame, and the fear was a gale-force wind threatening to extinguish it with every passing hour of silence. I replayed every interaction we'd had over the past few days. The way he looked at me when I brought him soup. The fever-hazed thank yous. The accidental touch of our hands. Were they just insignificant details, or were they clues? Was I a detective in a mystery of my own making, seeing patterns where none existed? The uncertainty was a knot in my stomach. Something had to give. The tension was unsustainable. We couldn't go on living like this, as two ghosts haunting the same apartment, afraid to even look at each other. But I was far too afraid to be the one to break the silence. The breaking point came 2 days after the night in his room. 2 full days of awkward silence and deliberate avoidance. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes from a dinner I'd eaten alone, when I heard his bedroom door open. I braced myself for another silent, fleeting encounter in the hallway. But this time was different. I heard his footsteps stop right behind me. I didn't turn around. I just kept scrubbing a plate that was already clean, my knuckles white as I gripped the sponge. Lucas, his voice was quiet, but it cut through the sound of the running water and landed right in the center of my chest. I turned off the tap, the sudden silence in the apartment deafening. Slowly, I turned around, drying my hands on a dish towel. He was standing a few feet away, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. It was a defensive posture, but his eyes told a different story. They were filled with a nervous, uncertain energy. He looked just as terrified as I felt. We need to talk, he said, his gaze dropping to the floor for a second before meeting mine again. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it, the moment of truth. He was going to apologize, tell me he was just out of it from the fever, and ask if we could just forget the whole thing and go back to normal. I prepared myself for the sting of rejection. Okay, I managed to say, my own voice thin and reedy. He pushed off the doorframe and took a step closer, then another, until he was standing in the middle of the kitchen with me. He still wasn't looking directly at me, instead focusing on some invisible spot over my shoulder. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I now knew meant he was anxious. About the other night, he started, and my stomach plummeted. I haven't been fair to you. This whole week. I just stood there, holding my breath, unable to form a response. I let him continue. I've been avoiding you, and that's not right, especially after everything you did for me. I was a mess, and you took care of me. I haven't even properly thanked you for that. You don't have to thank me, I said quietly. It's what anyone would have done, no, he said, finally looking me straight in the eye. His gaze was intense, unwavering. It's not, and that's kind of the point. He took a deep breath, like a diver preparing to plunge into icy water. The other night, when I had that nightmare, I wasn't out of my head. Not completely. I knew what I was asking when I asked you to stay. The knot in my stomach tightened, but this time it was with anticipation, not dread. And when I asked you to switch sides, that was, he trailed off, searching for the right words. That wasn't about being closer to the door, Lucas. That was about being closer to you. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. I felt lightheaded, dizzy with the shock of his confession. He had said it. He had actually said it. It wasn't a dream. I felt something for a while now, he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more earnest. I didn't know what to do with it. I've never, he gestured vaguely with his hand. He didn't have to say it. I understood. He'd never felt this way about a guy before. I was confused. And scared, honestly. And then I got sick, and you were just there. You were so kind and so patient. And all I could think about was how much I wanted you close to me. The whole thing, he admitted with a short, self-deprecating laugh. It felt like my one chance to test the waters, I guess. To see what it felt like to have you near without having to explain it. It was cowardly, I know. Using the flu as an excuse, it wasn't cowardly. I whispered, finding my voice at last. It was trembling. It was everything. A wave of relief washed over his face, so profound it was like watching a dam break. The tension in his shoulders eased, and the guarded look in his eyes softened into something warm and open. So, you felt it too? He asked, a hopeful, hesitant question. I could only nod, a lump forming in my throat. For a long time, I finally managed to say. A slow smile spread across his face. A real smile, not the easy, casual one he gave everyone, but a genuine, radiant smile that made his eyes crinkle at the corners in that way I loved. He closed the remaining distance between us in a single step. He reached up, his calloused hand surprisingly gentle as he cupped my jaw. My skin tingled at his touch. He searched my eyes for a moment, as if asking one last silent question. I gave another small, almost imperceptible nod, and then he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a tentative, questioning kiss. It was confident and sure, a release of all the tension and unspoken feelings that had been building between us for days, for months. It was a kiss that tasted of relief and a future I had never let myself imagine. All the fear, all the anxiety, all the overthinking, it all just melted away in the warmth of his lips. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, his thumb stroking my cheek. So, he breathed, a smile in his voice. I guess we're not just roommates anymore. And I laughed, a real, happy laugh. No, I said, I guess we're not. In the weeks that followed, the apartment transformed. The brittle tension was replaced by an easy, comfortable intimacy. The no man's land in the living room became our shared space, where we'd curl up on the couch to watch movies, my head on his chest, his arms securely around me. The silence was no longer awkward, it was peaceful. We learned to communicate not just with words, but with shared glances, small touches, and the simple, unspoken understanding that we were finally on the same page. Our first real date was simple. We got takeout from our favorite Thai place and ate it on a blanket in the park as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. We talked for hours, really talked, filling in the gaps of our lives that our roommate pleasantries had always glossed over. I told him about my family, my passion for design, and my anxieties about freelancing. He told me about the immense pressure from his father, his secret love for poetry, and his fear that he was just a clumsy, unrefined construction guy who didn't fit into my world. We discovered that for all our apparent differences, we were both just trying to find our place, to be seen and accepted for who we truly were. Navigating the shift from roommates to boyfriends was surprisingly seamless. It felt less like a dramatic change and more like a natural evolution, like we were finally settling into a dynamic that had been waiting for us all along. My minimalist, organized side of the apartment began to blend with his more chaotic, lived-in side. One of his dusty work boots would end up next to my neatly aligned shoes. My sketchbook would be left on his side of the couch. Our lives were intertwining, creating a new, shared reality that was far richer and more vibrant than the separate ones we had lived before. One evening, a month or so after his confession in the kitchen, we were lying in his bed, now our bed, more often than not, reading in comfortable silence. It had been a long day for both of us, and the quiet was a welcome comfort. I felt a familiar shift in the mattress, and a moment later, the warm, solid weight of his leg hooked over mine. It was the same gesture from that fateful night, the one that had sent my world spinning. But this time, it wasn't born from fear or a desperate need for an anchor in the dark. It was casual, possessive, and deeply loving. I smiled, closing my book and setting it on the nightstand. I turned on my side to face him. He looked up from his own book, a questioning look in his eyes. "What?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. I just shook my head, my heart full. "Nothing," I said. I really like it when you do that." A soft, knowing smile touched his lips. He shuffled closer, pulling me against his chest and wrapping his arms around me. "Good," he murmured into my hair. "Because I plan on doing it for a long, long time." It's funny how life works sometimes, isn't it? You can spend years building walls to protect yourself, living in a safe, predictable routine, convinced that you know exactly how your story is supposed to go. You convince yourself that some things are just not meant for you. And then, one day, someone gets the flu. Someone has a nightmare. And in the middle of the night, a whispered command and the simple weight of a leg thrown over your own can tear down every single one of those walls. It turns out that the greatest changes, the most profound connections, don't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes, they start with a whisper, in the dark, when you're brave enough to offer comfort, and even braver to accept it.